The real key to jig fishing first is to know what a bite actually feels like, and this deals with sensitivity. So the first thing I want to do is make sure I'm set up for success in terms of sensitivity. For me, that means I'm going to be putting braid on. If you have not used braid on your jigs before, wow, it's like the light is turned on. It is amazing what you can feel down there. And even if you use braid to, let's say, a fluorocarbon leader, same thing, you're just going to be super impressed with the sensitivity. The next thing is I want to make sure that I've got a rod that matches jig fishing. So at the minimum, that's going to be a medium heavy power rated rod, and that's going to also help transmit some of that key information from the end of the line to your hands. And speaking of hands, the last thing that I recommend for jig anglers, and I do this all the time, especially if you're new trying to learn this lure, is I run this line through my fingers. Fingers are more sensitive than anything else that we can possibly imagine. So if you've got that braided line and you got it running through your fingers, you are going to feel so much more than if you don't. So if you it's a little awkward at first, but man, it just really helps you determine what that bite, or when you get a bite, what it feels like. The next thing is we need to understand the type of bite based on where our jig is at in the presentation. There's basically three portions to fishing a jig, okay? Number one is on the drop. When that jig is dropping through the water column, oftentimes that bite is almost imperceptible. So there's things that we need to be looking for. One, you need to be a line watcher. If you see that line stop falling, or quit falling before it should, set the hook. The next thing is look for the slightest movement to the side. Now if the bass inhale it and swim off, oh, perfect. That's an ideal world. But be watching that line. That jig is most effective when it's dropping on a slack vertical line, okay? And that's where this becomes difficult for new jig anglers to figure out what that bite feels like. Watching that line is such a critical, key, important part of this. Next is when that jig is sitting on the bottom, okay? After the lure drops, I like to leave it just sit right there, or make it vibrate and twitch just the tiniest little bit. This bite right here is going to feel slightly different than when the jig is on the drop. You may start to feel more of that telltale thump that people talk about, but oftentimes what I feel is weight. All of a sudden the rod feels a little bit mushy. When that lure is just sitting there, the bass will inhale it, and they don't usually swim off fast. They just kind of pull it in and then just start the meander on their way. Usually when they take off quickly with it is when there's multiple fish in an area. So if you feel that thump and that line runs, make sure you hit that area really well, because there's probably more bass down there. But feel for that slight thump, and then for a little bit of mushiness, just a little bit of weight, and set that hook. And the last part of this is when you're dragging that jig across the bottom, or giving it really small hops. This is the easiest for people to feel, especially new bass anglers, because there's less slack in the line. The previous two portions of jig fishing, the drop and sitting on the bottom, usually we've got a little bit of slack, right? Well, when you're starting to drag it, that slack has been removed, and this is when you can feel a definitive thump. And anything that feels strange, always set the hook. Some of the biggest bass that I have caught jig fishing starts off with a facial expression like this. It's because something feels weird. Boom, set the hook. Now, a couple other factors that will help you land that fish, get it to the boat or get it to the shoreline, is, like I mentioned earlier, make sure you've got a rod matched for the situation, at least a medium heavy power rating, and that's going to get the fish to keep their head from burying up down in that cover that you're pulling them out of. A high-speed reel is also extremely effective, once again, because it gets that fish coming towards you. When we're jig fishing, they're often in places that we can easily get hung up. And also, this is the time when I take my drag and crank it all the way tight. I do not want that fish to pull line. I mean, bury up farther into that brush pile, get deeper into the weeds. And when I'm jig fishing, I've got heavier line on, so I'm not worried about breaking. So crank that drag down and you're going to land more fish. And also, this is the time for that powerful hook set. When you see those great video montages of professional anglers just rearing back with that powerful vertical hook set, this is the time when you use those. And once again, it's to get that fish coming towards you and out of that thick cover. And hey, if you would like to watch a video that talks about an interesting approach to fishing jigs and or Texas rigs, go ahead and check this one out right here. And make sure that you go out and encourage someone today. You never know how you might just change their life. For the Bass Fishing Life, I'm your host, Steve Rogers.